There we go. Thank you. So it's our final learning community session of the year. We're going to do a quick icebreaker, and we're going to do it in groups so we can connect with each other before the end of the year. I'll do a little recap. We'll be joined by Edward, our colleague from Health Communications, he's coming back to talk a little bit more about dissemination of the data and stories that we've been talking about through the year. We'll do a breakout discussion and a share back. In the chat, if you don't mind just sharing your first name and your pronouns, we are actually going to break out into small groups for our icebreaker, but love to just, welcome everyone into the conversation as Chen Chen prepares the breakout groups. You could just welcome yourself into the group. And the icebreaker for the chat, so just a little discussion for folks. What's your favorite holiday tradition, seasonal tradition? And share a special memory you have of it or something you're looking forward to this year. So just to model, this is actually sort of a new tradition, but my friends started having a solstice party. And it's just a, sort of, I guess, non-religious way to celebrate the season. And we are able to share sort of things that we're thankful for, what we're looking for into the new year. We didn't get to do it last year because our host had unfortunately gotten COVID, so we had to cancel. So I'm really looking forward to it this year and hoping everyone stays healthy. It's just always a fun time. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So are your breakout groups all set, Chen Chen? Okay. Folks can go into their rooms. Our past learning sessions. We, of course, started our annual meeting focusing on movement building framework and identifying like key concepts and what makes up a movement building. And then we kind of dove into what does that look like for the funds and how you guys are using movement building, what roles you play in movement building. And then we began to connect that more into what does that look like in storytelling? How do we use storytelling and narratives to demonstrate impact and to really tell the story of that collective work that we're doing. We also explored like how evaluation can help inform stories. And in August, we dug deeper into the specifics of storytelling, more on the communication side of that and what components make up what makes compelling stories, what, how you might achieve those stories through videos or through different tools that you might use to tell your story. And then we talked about effective communication strategies in our last session. We shared a tool that can help you identify those key audiences and strategies that you want to implement and to connect the larger stories to other components in your communications efforts. And today we're going to be talking more specifically about dissemination of those data and stories. And so I think I'll turn it over to you now, Edward. And I guess this is a good transition slide too, which is something that we shared in our first session with Edward a couple months ago, which is movement building fosters collective power and narrative change strategies challenge dominant ways of thinking to inspire and maintain change. And it's a really great way for us to connect all of the moving parts of our work and think about, how can we be more strategic in the ways that we do that? And now I'll turn it over to Edward, and I don't know if you have other things to add on this slide before I move on to the next one.
No, not on this slide. you asked this morning to keep it, and every time I look at it, I just think of it's a really thoughtful and helpful way of like stitching all the pieces together. So I'm glad that we had it up, but I think that that's okay, and we can jump into the next section.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So I think by way of a little bit of a reintroduction, my name is Edward Alexander. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm on the health communications team here at HRIA. I'm based in LA, so it's a little early for me. So if I sound like I just woke up, I promise I didn't just wake up, but it is early. But I'm really grateful to be here with you all. A couple months ago when I was here in this space, we had a really energizing conversation. And it was really helpful just to like watch and test some of these ideas and get to work with you all and share a little bit and also hear from you. So I'm hoping we get to continue that a little bit. So this morning, like Jamia said, just going to kind of continue the conversation and drill here a little bit more specifically into dissemination strategies and kind of what we do with all of the things that Jamia just recapped. So by way of offering like another way of thinking about a recap, that'll be really helpful to how I'll be leading the session. I just want to like start with by this point. So all of the things after going through all of the things that we just went through, by this point, you should have a couple things. You should have set your goals and identified your audiences. You should have drafted some kind of communications plan, and you should have identified stories in key messages. And so once you kind of like have those three things, there's always this gap between strategy and action. And the hope is today that we can talk through that a little bit and I can offer some guidance about what do we actually do with the strategies? What do we do with these three things to really make effective change and measure that and do something with our stories? So the question I find myself asking often is where do we go from here? If you're a Solange head like me, that's also a great song. But I found myself asking myself that question like pretty often, especially over the last week, to be honest with you. And so I put it here just as a reminder that like we have all of these things, all these components the building blocks of something. The question that we have to ask of ourselves and trying to answer is what do we do with it? Where do we go from here? And the other side of that is how do we use all of this strategy? So if you can go to the next slide, we can get into the meat and potatoes. So I'm not going to talk too much, but I do want to just like offer a couple really like tangible things that we can all work with and hopefully walk away from today. So when I think of applying a strategy, I think of really like three key things. If you've done all of the pieces on the previous slide, so you have your goals and you have your audiences, you've done the work of identifying messages, you've done the work of starting a communications plan. There are really three things that I think help you take the next step into being into like having a specific strategic and effective dissemination strategy. The first is to set clear and specific communication objectives. This is actually something that you kind of like do in concert with making communications plan, but it's really, really important to set clear and specific communication objectives and then to come back to them. I think the biggest thing that happens sometimes when you make a strategy is that you'll make a plan and then you'll be like, we planned, and then you'll sit it down and you'll walk away from it and you won't come back to it. But the goal here is to be really, really specific about where your communication objectives are and then to come back to them. So one way to set like good, strong communication objectives is to use this know, believe, do framing. So the way that this works is if you have a goal, you just as a overall, we want our communications to do whatever your goal is. And then you have audiences, and your audiences are the folks that you're really going to be communicating with to reach your goal. The way the know, believe, do framing works, and again, I'm not going to do like the full description of this, but the way the know, believe, do framing works is kind of that what are the things that you want your audience to know? What are the things you want them to believe? And what are the things that you want them to do? And so when you create your communication objectives, you really want to be specific to your audience. You're like, what do I need to educate them in? What do I need to teach them? What do I need them to believe? And then what do I need them to do? And those questions come with another set of questions, right? So if we're really being thoughtful and specific about those objectives, then we have to ask, well, if we want them to know something, where do they go to learn? What are the avenues, the mediums, the strategies? Where do they go to learn things? If we need them to believe something, we have to ask, who do they trust? Who do they already believe in? Can we build that kind of trust so that they can believe us or shift their thinking? And if we need them to do something, we have to ask, what will it take to get them to act, right? So these three sets of objectives really help us be thoughtful and strategic. And this will be important when we get to dissemination strategies in a second. The second thing in applying a strategy that you have to be really honest about is your organizational capacity. And capacity means a lot of different things. It means skills, like what competencies do your staff already have? How much time do you have to allocate to these things? What's your budget? Do you have budget to support a communications plan? And do you have resources? Resources beyond budgets, right? So resources meaning relationships and like access to training. And you'll see on the next slide when we look at some different dissemination strategies that you'll need resources to do certain things. But being honest about your capacity is really important when you start to think about what can we actually do with our plan. The third thing is to set realistic timeline for the length of your campaigns. And this is important because hopefully you want to be willing to think long term and not just short term. Sometimes we think of an idea and we say, this is our campaign, this is our story, this is what we need to get out. We think about the 1 or 2 strategies that we can be doing right now to get our story out. But the plan and the hope is that if you build a strategy, if you spend the time doing all the research to build a strong plan, that you actually will have the kind of space to think longer than 6 months, longer than just 2 months, longer than a couple weeks. And the hope is that if you do that, you can start to connect different efforts. So these kinds of plans really help you think, how do we do a social media strat campaign at the same time that we're running a blog post series, at the same time that we're updating the website, just for one example. So being willing to set a timeline and be really thoughtful about how long will any effort take. One, sometimes we're not always honest about that with ourselves, how long something will take to do, but then also how long could we really be thinking about this campaign? How long could we think about sharing these stories? What's the long durée of them? How will they exist beyond even just the 1 or 2 things that we plan for? So when I think about applying a strategy and moving from kind of what we've talked about in previous sessions, what you all have talked about in previous sessions, I've only been at one of them, but when I think about moving from that to the really tangible and specific dissemination strategies, I think about these 3 things. How do we set clear and specific objectives? How do we assess our organizational capacity? And then how do we set realistic timelines for the length of our campaigns? So the next thing, Jimmy, if you go to the next slide, there are just a couple examples here. This is not an exhaustive list. It's really important that I say that because sometimes we'll see a list of possible options and we'll say, this is it. I'm just going to screenshot this, and this is what I'm going to take and build all of my communications plans for the rest of the time. So I just want to be really, really clear. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just an example I put together of some things that I've seen done and that I've done that are higher capacity on the left side and lower capacity on the other side. I also want to acknowledge that sometimes these could be one or the other. So like in some instances, some of the things that are in the lower capacity really are going to take more capacity. They aren't always, this isn't like a perfect binary. Things don't fit in the boxes really well. But these are just like some potential options. And after we work through this slide, I'm going to pause for questions and then show you a couple examples of case studies of things that I've seen done in the past. But before we get there, I really just want to like talk through some of this a little bit, because the question for all of us is like, okay, I have a plan, and yes, these are some helpful options, but how do I know what I need to do? How do I know what to pick? How do I know what makes sense for my context and for my audience? So the story here on this slide to me is really like, have we done a good job of answering the questions on the previous slide? So have I done the work of identifying like really clear objectives? Because if we have, we can answer a question like, what dissemination strategies, what on this list will meet our audience in a way that will reach our objectives? So if we say our audience, we want them to know whatever the thing is, then we need to also be thinking about, well, where do they learn? as I said before. So if you know where they learn, maybe you will say, okay, you know what? They actually our audience learns a lot on social media. So a good strategy for us is to lead a social media campaign. But if you need them to learn something that's more complicated, right? You might say, okay, this is not going to work on Facebook. Um, you might say, we need something to explain this more complicated topic. And that might lead you to say, okay, we need to actually produce a series of videos. If you've answered the question about your capacity and really been thoughtful about what skills you have internal to your program or to your team, if you thought about how many resources you have, you might look at this list and just kind of like cross out a whole side of it, right? You might say, we don't have budget to send folks to conferences. We don't have budget to update our website. We don't have budget to host photography shoots. We don't have budget to start a blog post series. We don't have budget to produce videos. And in that situation, you end up needing to look at the lower capacity strategies and be really thoughtful about what can we do with what we have. If you've been really clear about your timeline and you kind of say, you know what, we have the time to do some more things, you might be able to look at things across both of these buckets and think about how they play with each other, right? So sometimes we want to start a social media campaign, but you know what's really helpful for a social media campaign? Having good photography, having videos that you can share. And so you start to see how these things work in concert. So I just want to like talk through this list here really quickly, and then I'm gonna pause and take a couple questions. But on the higher capacity side, the first one is producing videos. This is, I think, probably the heaviest of the strategies here. And when you're producing videos, you also want to think about where are they going. So if you produce a video, you need to think about like, how are we publishing it? Where are we posting it? Is it going on YouTube? Is it going on our social media? Do we have a website to host it? Are we hosting an event to premiere it? Are we going to give it to partners so that they can share it? Another strategy is to update your website. And when I say update website, the reason that this is on the higher capacity side is that this is more than just kind of like, updating your about page on your website, but really being thoughtful about like the whole user experience of like being on your website, right? So when we're updating our website, we have to ask the same questions about our audience. What do we want them to know? What do we want them to believe? And what do we want them to do? And then we have to organize our website in a way that meets those needs. So if we have a very clear goal that's like, we want them to click on a specific button and take a certain action, then our website has to get updated to reflect that. And that often will take a lot of work, right? That's design, that's copy editing, that's the actual development of a website. That's all of these things. Another item here is blog posts. I put this in higher capacity. It's probably more like a medium capacity thing. But when we start thinking about blog posts, there's lots of things that we have to consider, right? Like who's writing them? Do they have the skills to write them? Are you publishing them yourselves? Are you trying to get them published elsewhere? Are you starting a newsletter? Are you trying to write op-eds actually? Is that really what you're trying to do? There's lots of different ways that a blog post can go, but specifically if you're trying to start a series of them, you want to be really thoughtful about editing and hosting and all of these things. The fourth is photography shoots. I think in an age where video is so prevalent, photography shoots sometimes get overlooked. Part of the reason I put them on this list is because we all use stock photos. And when we aren't using stock photos, we're using iPhone photos. And sometimes the thing in the middle, which is just like a well-done, well-produced photography shoot, is really helpful just to have content to put on your reports and to put on your one-pagers and to put on your website and to put on your social media campaigns or your infographics. And having these kinds of images is really helpful just to have like a list, an archive of them that you can use. The fifth item here is conference presentations. This is my opportunity to make a plug that I feel like I'm always making, but when I say communications, I don't think that it is separate from community engagement. And I think that's really important to say out loud because there are things on both of these lists that sometimes folks would look at and will not think that they are communications activities specifically. But they are. If we're really thoughtful about our plans and our strategies, then our communications and our community engagement efforts are really, really linked. And I think that this conference presentation is one of those where relationship building is really important for a successful communications effort. And so to be really thoughtful about like, can we go somewhere and make a presentation? Can we show up to a space and build a relationship? That's a really helpful engagement activity. That's also a really, really powerful and important communication strategy. And then on the lower capacity side, there's making infographics. Use Canva. There's no shame in using Canva. Canva's great. I hope that everybody in this room has a Canva account. Maybe you don't have a premium account, but you can still do a lot with the free one. Canva really makes the world go round at this point. And if you have more capacity, more skills, then you look at things like InDesign or Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever the case might be. But there's no shame in using Canva at all. The next is social media campaigns. We have all seen a social media campaign. Sometimes we see them that are more effective. Sometimes we see them that are less effective. But the importance of any good social media campaign, whether you're paying in producing it at a higher capacity or really just trying to use what you have, is being really thoughtful and clear. What do you want to say? What does your audience want to hear? What will they believe and what will they trust in? And the next press releases. Press releases can go out pretty quickly. If you have a template for press releases or a structure for making press releases, you can constantly be changing and updating it. Just a pro tip on press releases that folks might know is that it's better to have something newsy to go along with them. So if you're hosting an event or you're releasing something that's kind of bigger and splashier, then press releases are really, really effective. And then connected to the conversation about community engagement, attending local meetings and just being present in whatever community that your audience is in is really important. And again, that doesn't always look like a communication strategy, but it's a really thoughtful one. It builds trust in you, in your organization. It builds relationships so that you can leverage those later. Just being present and attending local meetings is really important. And then finally, just as another idea, making and distributing flyers. And flyers here is a catch-all for just like physical materials, right? Like we might say flyers, and we might mean postcards. You might be tabling and just have a stand-up. But something that that you can just have physically is often a lower capacity thing that you can do, as long as you have a little bit of funds that you can allocate for printing. But it's really helpful just to get the word out depending on what your stories are and what your intentions are. I think one of the other things that isn't on this slide, but that's really important, is how do you do any of these things to meet decision makers? And I think what I want to say about meeting and influencing decision makers is just like any other audience, you want to be really thoughtful about what you want them to know, what you want them to believe, and what you want them to do. And specifically in the context of decision makers, what sometimes happens is that the strategies that are on here are not as effective. And the reason why is because you really need to like get them one-on-one. You need to have a more relational connection. You need to make sure that they're seeing the things that you're producing. If you make a report, just having a report and publishing it and emailing it to a decision maker isn't always the most effective, right? So you need to ask questions like, who do we know that has a relationship with them? How do we do the kind of like double communication strategy, which is to work really specifically with them to get a really to build a relationship, to get something in front of a decision maker so that you can say, hey, we made this. This is a report we think would be interesting for you. It might influence your policy in whatever way. And to really have that one-to-one connection, but then also what can we do to build external pressure, right? So that they're seeing it over and over again, so that their community members are seeing it, the folks that they're accountable to if they're elected official, so that they're seeing it. How can we building a press strategy at the same time that we have the relational piece of this influence decision makers more than doing any single one of these in concert. So just like two other questions just to guide our decision making as we're kind of looking at these strategies and trying to decide what is really helpful for us. One of the things that's always important to ask is, do I have credibility on insert platform? Sometimes we say, I'm going to start a social media campaign and that's going to reach our audience because they'll know about our information and they'll see the link to our website. Well, do you have a presence? Do you have credibility on Twitter or X? Sorry, I forget that Twitter's name is different. Do you have credibility on X? Because if not, it's going to take a lot of work to build that credibility, to have folks be able to trust you, to be able to have the reach that you might have otherwise. Do you have credibility to just kind of show up to a conference presentation and command a room and have folks really trust you and want to follow up with you? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. If anyone can write a blog post, but No one is going to read everyone's blog posts. So do you have the credibility? Do you have the trust built, the relationship built that is going to drive your audience to really engage with your materials? And then the other thing is, do we have the know-how to follow through on any one of these strategies? Some of the lower capacities are lighter lift, so you may not need to have as much capacity or know-how. And so they're easier to work through in that capacity. But some of the higher capacity strategies, they're going to take a little bit of know-how. They're going to take a little bit more know-how, a little bit more commitment to work all the way through, right? So we just got to be really honest. Do we have the capacity to kind of publish and edit and draft a whole series of blog posts? Do we have the capacity to train staff, to send them to conferences, and to really follow through with like being at a conference, presenting at a conference, doing the networking, and then doing the follow-up from their presentation? So these are just like a couple of other questions that we want to think about as we're selecting our strategies. But I just talked a whole lot, and I know that there's a lot on these last two slides. But the next few slides are a couple case studies that are just going to help kind of like walk through some of what it looks like to actually put all of these things into practice at different capacities. But before we get there, I just want to pause and take questions. And I haven't been looking at the chat, so if anything came in while I was talking, I didn't see it. Oh, I see a question or a hand.
Felicia?
It, thank you for the presentation. I'm looking at your capacities, and I noted that there's no mention of local media, whether it's radio or cable or local newspapers. And I wondered if those were intentionally left out.
No, not intentionally left out at all. Just want to be really clear. This is not exhaustive. I'm glad you brought that one up though, because it's really, really important. And it's a helpful reminder that some of these things will require kind of relationship capacity. And then also, I think for some of those efforts, press releases are helpful. To be really thoughtful about how to draft the press release in a way that's like newsy and effective. That sometimes will get people to think, okay, well, do you want to come on local media? Do you want to come do an interview on radio? The other thing that is important to mention in a press release is that you can draft all the press releases in the world, but if you don't have contacts, you don't have relationships with local media, like you're saying, where is your press release going and who's going to read it and who's going to do anything with it? So press releases are just kind of like one way to help build media relationship, but that's a really, really important strategy. And beyond just radio, also think of podcasts too. I think podcasts are increasingly kind of doing some of the work that radio did. It's not a replacement. I'm not saying that podcasting is like taking over the radio space, but be thoughtful about like local podcasts and local social media, video opportunities also in concert with radio. But that's a really great question. Thank you for asking in the elevator.
And then the second part of my question is, so would radio and cable be considered lower capacity?
I think if so, the binary is, this is where the binary becomes unhelpful, right? So I think if you have staff that have relationships with local media and that you feel comfortable speaking on behalf of your organization, or like that have the media training might even be the phrase, then we could think of it as lower capacity. Do you have folks that really could just like walk into a radio station and have a conversation that will be productive for your efforts? Do you have staff that have that credibility, that like name recognition in your community, that your audience will like hear their name and be like, okay, I'm going to listen to this? If that's the case, I think it's probably safer to kind of box that under lower capacity in some ways. But if you don't have some of that relationships, you don't have some of that like that training, that trust, that know-how, then you have to be thoughtful about building those capacities too. And I that's something I didn't say earlier that I probably should have, but the distinction between lower and higher capacity here is almost unhelpful in that we don't want you to look at things on the higher capacity and say, well, we can't do that. Sometimes a question about lower and higher capacity is about what can we be building towards? Like what capacity can we be building now to be able to more easily do some of these higher capacity strategies in the future. But that's a really great question.
Thank you.
I was also thinking as you were talking, Edward, it's like it's a combination of high capacity, low capacity is budget, staff time, prep, all of those things. But like the ways in which you execute each of these different strategies can also be like on this, like you can have a high capacity social media strategy. And you can have, sort of, phone videos that are not edited that can also be part of your strategy, right? Your dissemination strategy. So I think there's an opportunity to look and see what can we create in these spaces. And I think when you look at the higher capacity, like you can have very high quality components of those things, but you can also perhaps reduce costs by having local community members do that or different things like that. So I think it's interesting to think about like what high capacity, low capacity is and how you might interpret the way that you execute these different strategies.
See another
Per
hand.
Calpurnia, yeah, sorry.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for that, Edward. I guess something we're running into is that we're working with multiple CBOs, community-based organizations, and we're trying to think, how do we create a unified voice so that these types of sources have a larger impact? I think that's where the challenge is, because none of us are like media savvy people, and so trying to figure out how do we, I guess, coalesce and bring our voices together in one way to make larger inroads is something that I think I've seen a struggle with, but also heard of other groups mentioning the same thing too. So if you have any advice or ideas on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a really great question and a challenge that I run into often, in that you're not alone in facing. Jamia, can you pop up a couple of slides? I think like 2 slides. The kind of like recap slide. The other way, sorry. One more. Yes, here we go. Okay, the reason I came to this slide to answer this question is because I think part of the work that needs to happen in order to kind of coalesce around like a shared voice, a shared vision, happens even before you get to the spot of deciding what your strategies might be. And I think it's kind of it's a little bit in that third item here of just like you've identified stories and key messages. One of the things that's really helpful is just to be really thoughtful about what are our calls to action. If we're speaking to an audience and we want them to do a certain thing, what is it specifically that we want them to do, and to have a really like strong, clear set of calls to action can often be really helpful in grounding in a collective of people in how they communicate about an effort. The other thing is just like sometimes it's just canned language too. It's just like having a blurb that you kind of say. I like to think of talking points as being a communication strategy because they help everyone get on the same page. So I think between having clear calls to action, so clear places that we're all directing people to our website, for example. We're all directing people to our Instagram account, or we're all directing people to our video, and then us having some shared language, some talking points even to help folks move towards that goal. And it's not going to be perfect. I think the other thing that we should allow ourselves is that we are different. We communicate with people differently. If you have 5 people on a project team and they're all doing some kind of outreach on behalf of the project, they're all going to say things differently. And that's okay. You want that because you want things to feel personable and you want things to feel relational. You don't want things to feel like, so ironed out that they don't feel like they can be applied or modified to speak to different audiences in the ways that those groups of folks need to hear or will be receptive to. So it's a challenge. And the only real answer I have to this ongoing question that like I don't think I'm ever gonna perfectly figure out is as much of the planning and as much of like the collective building of a plan you can do can help you stay grounded in that. And I think the other piece, I didn't say this, and I hope it came up in previous sessions, but you don't have to make these communications plans alone. It's really important that you don't actually, that you engage the folks that will be implementing a communications plan or engage the audiences that are like that the communications plan is about, that you engage them in actually drafting the plan, that you engage them in testing your stories and drafting your key messages, and to ask, will these calls to action work? Because if you do all of these in isolation and then you kind of come out and say, I have a plan, this is what we're going to do, and it doesn't work, you're going to run into challenges. So that's not a real answer to your question, other than to say it's a really great question. And we will all kind of have to like continue to work through it and continue to kind of figure out the best answer to it.
Yeah, no, that was helpful. Thank you, Edward. And I think to your point about going back, I would even say go back to the SWOT analysis, the learning session last time, thinking about where the challenges and threats are and what needs to be, but where the opportunities are. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
I think we have a chance for maybe a question. Is it?
I just wanted to quickly add to what Calpurnia was asking. Calpurnia, a couple years ago, we worked together, a couple of CBOs and the city, to do a campaign for breast cancer, for mammography. And from that, just as you were asking your question, I thought about what we did. And so maybe what might work for your team is to think about what are the messages that you want to put out. What we did, we decided on the messages as a team, and we created those flyers and posters and videos that we wanted to post. And what each of us did was take them and post them in our own spaces. Understanding that it's the one message that's going out from the entire team. And one of the ways that you can do that is to just put the names in small letters at the bottom or the side. You can put the names of all the CBOs that are in the group, so everybody feels like they have a place in what's being put out and they're identified somehow. Because I do understand the challenges of identification, right? And so that's one way to think of it. You work around a theme and you all coalesce on what the theme is. You work on your message, and then you figure out, do you want to do your individual logos, or do you want to just have small prints of the names of the groups in the CBOs that you're working with at the bottom of whatever goes out, so that they're being identified and everybody has a way of saying to their superiors, well, this is where we're listed, so that people know who's working on the project. So just wanted to share that. And I'm looking for one of our flyers that we had put out. If I find it, I will just post it in the chat.
Thank you.
So I know I only have a couple minutes now. I have two examples. I want to just talk through them at a high level, and we will leave resources also for folks to look into it. But first, I want to say I am not taking responsibility for either of these. These are two efforts that I've kind of like worked on or heard about in different ways through my time at HRAA. But the first is UCAN. So UCAN is an effort based here I'm not going to say here because I'm in LA, but based in Mass. And it's really specific about substance use disorder. And UCAN has really strong messaging that you can kind of see. This is a screenshot of the website. We'll drop the website in the chat. But the really clear message that you can reverse an overdose, you can save a life. UCAN is a good example of kind of like what it might look like as to use a higher capacity set of strategies. If you go to the UCAN website, there are very clear calls to action. There are things that they very clearly want the audience to know, things that they want the audience to believe, and things that they want the audience to do. So you want them to know how to respond to an overdose, believe that they can respond to an overdose, and do the work, the actions of responding to someone having an overdose. And some of the things that they have on that the UCAN team did. They created and produced a series of storyteller videos, which you can see on their website, that really kind of like empower their audience to get to that place, to take the action. They've hosted kind of like media events and like kind of like awareness events. There are branded like physical materials that are really specific. So like rescue breathing masks that are like UCAN branded. So things like this, that if you have a thoughtful plan and the capacity, that you can really like put together a constellation of different strategies to really get your name and your word out there. So that's one example. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about another example, which is very different. If you want to skip to the next slide, Jamia. This is a slide from a slide deck that the Everett Youth Initiative Council made. The Everett Youth Initiative Council started in 2021 in Everett, Massachusetts. And there were a group of like teens that were really trying to have a voice in how Everett was using its American Rescue Plan Act funds. And so they did a lot of work and a lot of organizing, and we supported them through a project that we were kind of supporting different communities with ARPA funding on. We supported them to kind of like help them think a little bit more strategically about their communications, and just really support them in whatever ways that we could. But it was a group of youth, it was a group of teens in Everett. Their capacity was not as much as the UCAN team. And yet still they were awarded $1 million that the youth in the city of Everett were able to collectively kind of come together, vote on, and decide what projects they wanted to fund with some chunk of ARPA money. And it took a lot of work for them to get to that point. But what did they do? They used a lot of the lower capacity strategies that we referenced. They were in Canva a lot. They were making flyers and reports and guides. They were making presentations like this one. They were hosting kind of like learning sessions to get youth to city council meetings to advocate for themselves. And at the same time, this initiative, this effort was really successful. So in both cases, you can be really successful whether you're using a combination of high capacity strategies or a combination of lower capacity strategies. But you just have to be really strategic and really thoughtful about what you're saying, when, and will our audiences respond to the messages that we're making. So I just wanted to like kind of throw up those two case studies or examples, just as like two different ways to look at this, two different ways that we can really be thinking about building successful strategies and campaigns. And with that, I think I'm a little bit over time. So thank you all for taking the time and letting me come this morning and share a little bit with you all.
I'll just highlight that there's one comment in the chat. If you have thoughts on that before we go into breakout groups, what are some ways to reach audiences? In this case, I mean the funding audiences, if we have all the needed video stories, etc. So funders.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is to like really think about what platforms they're using and who are they listening to. I think and that's similar to any audience. I think specifically with some funding audiences, we have to think about like, are they looking at like philanthropy digest in some way, right? Can we somehow get messages into a philanthropy digest? Are there kind of policy things that we can be shifting or trying to elevate that they will be aware of? In that case, we might need to think more specifically about press strategies, right? So how can we kind of take the videos that we've made and the stories that we made and like start a press campaign about them to build more interest or fervor around whatever the idea that you're trying to share is. And then also, I think specifically with potential funders or funding audiences, there's a lot of value in the kind of like one-to-one spaces, showing up, building relationship, having conversations with them, putting your reports in front of them, doing the presentations, and then showing up to any potential like funding collaborative meetings. There aren't enough of those, but where they exist, they can be very valuable. So that's just like a quick set of ideas. I don't have a perfect answer to that question. If I did, I would probably be doing some different things right now. Jimmy is kind of nodding along. But yeah, I think that's like a perennial challenge. But the question that we always have to ask ourselves is, where are they getting their information? And what is it that we want them to do? Because we need to show up in the places that they get their information and make it clear that this is what we want them to know, believe, and do. And sometimes that takes just asking a couple funders, where are you getting information? What would be a good place to kind of push you in whatever way, or just to get this information to you? And I hope that's a helpful answer to that question.
Thank you, Edward. So now we're actually going to go into some discussion, and the questions that we have. We have these 3 questions, which you're gonna self-guide, guide yourself in the discussion. You can focus on 1 or 2 of these questions if you would prefer, but just some thoughts on how you might want to frame your conversation before we go into the breakout groups. If someone wouldn't mind throwing those into the chat so folks have them. But the questions are: what successes and challenges have you faced when sharing data and stories? How did you address them? What tips or tools from today's session seem most relevant to your work? How do you see yourself using them? How might you maximize limited resources? So you can have a conversation about, how you can apply what you've learned today, or just general conversation about the successes and challenges you've had with dissemination. And then if there's something like you're specifically trying to work through, uh, to connect with any potential specific decision maker or partner, excuse me, please share what you're thinking about, and get some ideas and brainstorm strategies with your group, because everyone has a lot of expertise. And it's great when we have opportunities to share. So these are the 3 questions. You can cover whatever you'd like to, what feels right in your group discussion. And then we'll have a share back, a general share back with everyone, and after that closes out. So can we open up the groups again? Oh, thank you. One more share back.
All right, folks, I hope those conversations were good. It sounds like there was a lot happening. Oh, looks like folks are still trickling in. I'm not going to jump too quickly into this. But yes, welcome back. We have a couple of questions that we hope will just kind of like guide this share back. We're going to drop them in the chat, but before we do that, I'm going to read them out loud, and then we'll stop screen sharing so that we can all see each other. So the first question: what new ideas or strategies did your group discuss for reaching target audiences? And then the second: were there any shared challenges across groups, and what solutions, if any, were proposed? I know that sometimes we don't always have solutions, but we'd love to hear if you all came up with some. And the third is: how might you apply what you've learned today to improve your storytelling efforts? So yeah, just looking forward to any kind of like responses to these 3 questions, or kind of insights from your breakout group. And then I think we'll drop those questions in the chat again and stop sharing the screen too.
Let me try to get them into the chat. All right, so
I don't know who was in what group, but did any groups elevate any kind of like new ideas or strategies? Did anything come up that was like collectively new?
Are we just speaking up, or? Okay, cool. I feel like in our group, we talked a lot about capacity as a core issue, and like there being a clear positive outcome when we're able to actually have one-on-one conversation with community members, whether it's through an initiative, a program, or just trying to get the word out. And we also know that that's just like not sustainable in our work. None of us have really appropriate funding to continue that level of communication on an ongoing basis. Many of us struggle with persuading our funders that translation services actually need to be first and foremost as a focus area for us to properly be, providing culturally responsive care, communication, trust building. And And that was kind of just a core theme that I feel like all of us touched on a little bit, is this need and understanding that people trust people. We're not in a moment right now where, frankly, sharing out on social media always works for a lot of our community members. My coalition really refrains from massive sharing info on any kind of feed. We try to keep it just to email and newsletter and word of mouth. And so it's really kind of sitting in that tension point of knowing what community needs, but not actually being able to consistently keep up with that tactic and with that modality, and trying to, persuade the powers that be, decision makers, funders, we need this kind of support. And we'd love to prove to you, if you gave us the funding, that this is the best way to be doing it. But it's hard to come to the table with the evidence that it is the best way when they're not funding you to be doing that work in the first place. So I don't know if that's maybe a little bit of issue, maybe a little bit of solution.
No, that's really helpful. I'm also really glad that you elevated translation and language justice and language access to communications. I didn't mention that earlier, but it's really important and also takes capacity, like thoughtful, intentional funding, budget, and capacity. Go ahead, I see a hand.
You're still muted.
I think Liz, is it Liz Ortega? I'm sorry, I forgot your first name. Liz?
I'm
Liz?
sorry, I was just trying to agree with what Temple says.
Oh,
We were
okay.
in the same chat, and I was just giving her a thumbs up. I put the wrong thing. Yeah, we were in the same chat, so that's exactly what we talk about. How we bring our information to the community, like face to face, how they trust people, how they trust who the information is being brought to, and how we promote our information. So we bring it to them. We do a lot of tabling, and that's how we get that information across. So yeah, I was agreeing with Temple, because we were in the same group and we talked about that.
Are there any challenges that came up in another? Oh, I see a hand. That's perfect time.
There were a couple of things. Juliet and I were both talking about how it's hard to know how to frame our actual conditions, because I'm like, 90 years old, so I've been doing this for a long time, and we used to get funded because of these terrible deficits. Well, as we're internally in our community trying to reframe how we think about ourselves and really do our work from this assets-based mentality, then we'll get pushback sometimes from funders that Juliet said it so beautifully, that because we don't come wearing rags and looking, totally pitiful, we can, and because maybe we have small deficits in our budget, or maybe last year we came in on budget, there's this perception that we don't need money. And then Alexis talked about how we could reframe so that we said, this is what we would do if we had all the money we needed. And this is what happens if we don't have all the money we needed. And so then I said, well, we're in a completely different context now. So there's two things I'm really worried about. There is a bill in play that will give the president the power to go after nonprofits deemed as terroristic or not like a threat to the Constitution. So if I write black lead, we know what that does. And so now I'm feeling this sense of paralysis, like I want to be true to who we are and what we're about. And I'm not trying to have, us or our fiscal agent lose our 501c3 status, or just have them looking for us. And we have to be candid and say that there's plenty of systemic racism in philanthropy. And so for a while, everybody went along because you couldn't not fund after George Floyd and the horrors of the pandemic. But I'm already seeing different questions that make no reference to race and equity in RFPs. So then telling our story becomes even harder. And I don't want to be bound by fear, which right now I'm kind of bound by fear. So I said, as we are, we need to look at all of our money and see what's coming from the feds, even if we get it from the state, did it trickle down so that we can make plans? But those plans should be, this money could go away, but together, like there's got to be folks on this screen who are doing allied work that I'm doing or similar work. And we need to be thinking about how do we tell our collective stories to each other so that we can stay asset-based. And like, I'm going to bring the bread to dinner. Steph is going to bring the soup. And somebody else is going to bring some cupcakes or cookies or something. Like, I think we need to have a very stone soup mentality when telling our story. And the more, like, I'm not going to not tell the truth that my community is Latinx and Black, but I also care very deeply about the town next door that's majority white and poor and going to be harmed by these same things that we're worried about. And so we've got to tell our story together.
I know I'm facilitating this show back and should say something right now, but I don't know what to say. I really appreciate everything that you just said. I think one thing that I might say that hopefully feels helpful, and maybe I made allusion to it, but not specifically enough earlier, but this idea about thinking about capacity was not supposed to be restrictive. And to me and in my brain, having a conversation about capacity is as much about like what capacity can we collectively build and what kind of like skills might we be able to share and elevate so that we can do bigger things collectively. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm hearing coming out of what you're saying. Like, how can we share with each other? How can we plan with each other so that we can like collectively kind of put our capacity in the same direction? We might not always have the same goals and same audiences, but where they overlap, it makes a lot of sense for us to combine efforts. So
that's great, Edward. And I hope HRIA will take that as sort of walking papers. I feel like I'm going to trainings this week that were planned 3 months ago, and now we're working in a very different context. And so we could all maybe use just a look back at, what we've done and lift out the things that maybe we learned a year ago that are really applicable today that we didn't realize we would need to strengthen that muscle again. But I love your idea of this broader collective, pooling of resources. And by that, I don't necessarily mean give me your money. I mean, teach me what you know, and I'll try to teach you something back.
This is Stephanie. I just sort of adding to Liz's really important and critical points that to whatever degree HRA and the funding partners can help advise us, in these early days of and how we anticipate change and how that's going to impact us, not just in a fiduciary way, but in terms of being able to be vocal about who we serve. And the fears around that, but it may be that we need a learning session sort of devoted to these concerns and topics and some guidance.
And if I could impose in our work, no matter what work we do, we're always doing extra. People may come to me to talk to me about food, but they'll mention that I'm just going to use you, Stephanie, because you're right there, that they have and this is something that has happened, that they have a child that they think needs more than just the glasses that they got at school. And so then I'm spending time trying to help them because I'm not going to say, I don't know, you've got to look. And somebody else could be working in housing and they're getting asked questions about food. And I'm feeling depleted. Like our work is always really hard. I'm personally scared myself. And I work with a lot of families whose documentation is not what some would say it should be. And they're asking me to sign custody agreements for their kids. And I'm trying to help them get in line for passports in case the parents are deported. And I think I don't know how to take care of myself when I'm trying really hard to not convey all of my fears to the community and to my staff. But I know I need to, because if I implode, we're all going to implode together. So I'm really hoping that HRA can help us figure some of this out. Like maybe if you have the ability to think about what sorts of trainings and supports and skill shares we can have, if not until the new year, because I feel like a lot of us are just flopping in the wind and trying to tread water, and we don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely transition this conversation a bit, and we're running out of time, so I'll just kind of step in to close this out. But yeah, I think, we've been talking about what the learning community can look like in the future, and specifically considering what this space could be like. Incorporating what you're saying into the spaces we already have. One thing that I can probably suggest is that there are a lot of other organizations kind of talking through what this kind of space looks like. And I would be happy to, in our newsletter, kind of forward a lot of those conversations, like in sort of the immediate future, like through this year, and then we can continue to chat on our team. We haven't completely thought this through like as an organization either. So, there's still some thinking that we have to do across our, departments. But I think as we have our own ideas about what that could be and what's helpful to you, we'll definitely share them. But I guess I'm just saying in the meantime, I know there are other organizations having conversations about this, and maybe we can share with each other what like that is. I think there's actually a conversation happening next week that I received, that I can try to see if it's still open. But yeah, stuff like that, I think in the meantime would be great. It's more of an immediate response type thing. I also think like in the state, sort of the parameters that are being put up would be good to hear, what's happening at the state level and protections that are being put up. And so that can be helpful to know as well, where there might be that tension between the state and the federal government. But yeah, I'm definitely hearing the challenges. I'm hearing how this sort of messaging and the way that you do it becomes even more important in these challenging times as well. And definitely we want to be a resource for that. It's also a nice transition into our survey that Caitlin just put out, which is asking for feedback on today's session, but also an opportunity if there's specific things that you're thinking through. We ask for like any other general feedback or what you want to learn in the future in that survey as well. It'd be great to just add that in there too, so that we can capture a lot of these things, even for folks who haven't spoken. If there's something you are thinking about. I know we just completed like a capacity building survey a couple weeks ago, and even sort of maybe some of those thoughts have shifted, but would love if you could complete this survey and provide that feedback to us there. Just the last session we have is tomorrow, an evaluation session that's focused on building relationships with target communities. And it provides like an additional context to this related to evaluation components. And then the other capacity building activities we have is program officer check-ins, which have been running from October through November. So if your program officer has reached out to you to do a check-in to make sure you've scheduled that and are connecting with them. And then we're kind of closing off for the year And we're, you know, envisioning what that work will look like in the future. But this has been really helpful. I don't want to keep you guys any longer, so please do complete that survey. Thank you all for your engagement. Thank you, Edward, for your expertise in this space. And I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and a good day, and continues to just, you know, we've been here before and we will get through this, right? So that can be a binding thought for us. So have a good one all.